I come from a community, a small town, that a lot of people have had opinions about and have told me, they're not very gracious opinions. And yet I have seen some really kind of incredible successes inside the community in terms of people doing wild things or crazy things or things that we just thought couldn't happen here. We've just had wins. And I'm like, oh, those are just myths that other people were kind of sharing and really just putting their own insecurities about their community. So I have seen the work pay off.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, then just keep going.
You're listening to Granite Goodness, the show where we interview New Hampshire people making the world a better place. My name is Andy DeMeo, and today we will be recording in my home in the Mount Washington Valley of New Hampshire. My guest today is Emmett Soldati. Emmett is a lifelong Granite Stater and small business owner running to represent District 1 on New Hampshire's Executive Council. He hails from Somersworth, and you may better know him as the creator and proprietor of Teatotaller Cafe. We talk about a bunch of stuff. We talk about the everyday issues facing Granite Staters. We talk about how to communicate simple solutions to complex problems. We talk about LGBTQ plus people and their community and their beloved history in Somersworth. We talk about optimism and problem solving. We talk about all that and a bunch of other stuff on this episode of Granite Goodness. I hope you enjoy it. Emmett Soldati.
Hello there.
Welcome to Granite Goodness.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We're here with our executive producer, Rooster.
Yep.
I don't know if he's showing up on camera or not, but his presence is felt.
Yes, very noticeable.
Yeah.
Very calming.
So I'm lucky I caught you on your way to something today, right? You've got like an event going on in Jackson?
Yep. I'm on the campaign trail. So you just take Route 16 and you'll find me.
This is nice. I read a book over the summer that was about like the whistle stop campaigning of the Pat. Like they used to campaign on trains and stuff all the time, people for president. And I don't know. It was the kind of book, like it made me nostalgic for a life that I never, like I wasn't there.
Yeah.
But the idea, I don't know, it sounds pretty cool.
The railroad is still there. And at least it goes up to Ossipee, but it's just carrying sand these days.
Maybe I'm going to milk your appearance and the relationship that I'm cultivating with you. Someday when you're leader of the free world, I'm going to say priority one is build a railroad through my property. And I'm going to be the ultimate YIMBY, yes, in my backyard. I'm going to say build it through, and then we can have all kinds of whistle stop people.
Yeah, well, there is a rail from Ossipee to Conway. It used to be called the Snow Trail. It would take all the people from Boston that wanted to go skiing. And yeah, it was actually quite popular. I think the Great Depression is sort of when it started to wane. And now, yeah, the rail is really just run by some commercial enterprises. But the Executive Council actually makes some decisions around transportation.
Oh, okay. That's good.
Would love to see more rail in passenger rail in New Hampshire.
We can get into all that. Although it does remind me, you probably know, I always hear about like some of the crazy industries that used to, like, wasn't there a whole ice industry like in Boston and
actually Milton? So speaking of the rail, one of the industries that the rail was most utilized for was ice farming, and in Milton, New Hampshire, was a massive ice operation to bring ice down to Boston. But the advent of like electric cooling and refrigeration kind of put a very quick end to that industry. But yeah, you'd see people out there. I've seen photos of people like cutting the ice up in these massive blocks and putting ice on trains.
Yeah, and they'd insulate it with like sawdust and all these crazy things.
Yeah, shipping ice.
We should bring that back.
Yes, definitely. Bring ice shipping.
If you're looking for pro work policies, that's everyone's going to be for that.
I can tell you refrigeration is expensive.
Yeah.
If someone was just shipping me ice, I'd love it.
Yeah. All right. So we always like to start these, as much as I want to talk about the history of ice and the ice industry in New England with you. We could probably just do a whole episode on that.
That was the extent of my knowledge.
No, well, I don't know.
Making things up
I don't know.
after that.
I did do some research. I know where you went to school. You're a pretty smart guy. Can you tell us a little bit about your New Hampshire credentials, your history? This is Granite Goodness. It's a show about New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. I know you live here, but for the viewers, the relationship between Emmett Soldati and the Granite State, give us the picture.
Yeah, I've got my badge here. So my grandfather was actually lived in Somersworth, New Hampshire, and went to Hilltop High School, which is Somersworth School. So I'm a third generation. So he was here, and then his son, Lincoln Soldati, he was also Lincoln. So my dad was born in the Seacoast, went to St. Thomas in Dover, and married my mom, who is from out of state, and settled in Somersworth. And then me and all of my three siblings were born at Frisbee Hospital in Rochester, and we all went to Hilltop Elementary School. And so, born and raised, and grew up in Somersworth. Later on with school and then college, went away and spent some time out of the country for my studies. And then shortly after I finished graduate school, which was in London, I moved right back to Somersworth.
Yeah.
And have been literally in the same place ever since.
Man, that's a very succinct. Sometimes I ask people that question and it doesn't go where you expect it to go.
No, yep. But I have lived in basically two places, and they're a block away from each other.
Oh man, that's very charming though. And I know that teetotaler, right? For folks who don't know, and I hope they do if they're tuning in. And for context, I give a little introduction, like I'll tell a little bit about you to the viewers, in the first minute or so. But it's always fun to hear in people's own words. This is the teetotaler guy for
that's me.
All the people listening. My listener base is enormous, by the way.
I can imagine.
It's my mom and my dog.
All right. I hope one of them has been a teetotaler.
Yeah. No, I did actually bring my mom there once. I was like, this is the coolest place in the whole state. It's wonderful. We used to go there all the time. It was we'd go on Sundays. I don't remember what we did. There was some other activity, but the part I remember was we do X and then we go to
Was this in Somersworth?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Cool.
Back when I was living down there. So I know that you're running for executive council. Mm-hmm. Can you demystify what that is for some of the people listening? Yeah,
absolutely. And so maybe just as background, so I've had this cafe Teatotaller for basically the entire time that I've moved back to my hometown. And several years ago, maybe 2019, a gentleman walks into the cafe while I'm slinging lattes or making someone's bubble tea. And he introduces himself. He says, "Hello, I'm Andrew Valinsky. I'm your executive counselor." And, he sort of had heard about some of the work I'd done in the community. And he said, I'm going to be running for governor. And so I'm going to be vacating my seat. And you should consider running for executive council. And, I'm, other than college, a lifelong Granite Stater. I've always voted here. And I said, "What is the executive council?" I was like, that sounds like a great idea.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so Andrew explained, and I would go on to learn that we have a unique form of government in New Hampshire. We love to do things differently, for better or for worse. And our executive council, of which there used to be many more in the country, governors' councils, executive councils, which was a form of authority within the executive branch to really be a check on the governor. And another way you can think about it is it's a weak governor system. So we don't empower our governor with sort of entire unilateral, complete authorities to execute contracts and appoint attorneys general and so forth. We have this group of, in New Hampshire, 5 people, 5 counselors that vote on virtually all contracts, all appointments. So every commissioner, every head of every agency, every deputy commissioner, and every judge. And our transportation plan, which is why rail comes
right.
up sometimes.
Yeah.
So the executive council really is the way that we conduct executive branch decisions, and it's split into districts. So because there's 5 of them, we split the state into 5 districts rather than, you don't go into the booth and vote for 5. Everyone will vote for 1 counselor.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it's districted. It is a interesting case study in gerrymandering, which is drawing maps to basically consolidate power for a political party, even if it doesn't reflect the actual proportion of voters that support that political party.
I've seen the map. It's a strange looking map.
It's very strange, and it seems to get stranger every 10 years. So when Andrew Volinsky walked into my doors, he lived in Concord, lived in a district in Somersworth that went from Somersworth to Concord to Keene. So it's basically the belt of New Hampshire. And then after the redistricting, which happened in 2020, they moved Somersworth and much of Stratford County into what's called District 1, which is the North Country. Mm-hmm. So my district now goes from Durham, which is not far from my house, up to the Canadian border.
Whoa.
And really hugs Route 16, much of it, except for it also covers the entire Lakes region. So wraps around with Route 11. So
I'm imagining in my head.
It is literally half of the state. Even though it's 1/5 of the population, it is half of the state's land and water mass. So that is the executive council. 4 years ago, I did run for that seat, and it was a very blue gerrymandered district. Mm-hmm. And now I'm running in District 1, and I'm running against a Republican incumbent.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. I don't think I'd ever heard the executive council described in that way, let alone at all, to be frank. But
yeah.
But I don't know. I'm kind of curious now. Like, what do you think is? I mean, are there good things about the executive council? Are you against it in theory, or is it just eh? Like, is anyone talking about getting rid of it, or how many? I don't have a sense of that whole landscape.
Well, if you were to look up the history of executive and governor's councils in America, you would see 1866 dissolved in mm-hmm. Nebraska, 1895, North Carolina, Virginia, many executive council bodies have been dissolved over the years because certain states have found them to be not effective.
Yeah.
And there is certainly an argument that it is ineffective or it's duplicative of the governor's work. I think what's interesting in New Hampshire is we are a relatively purple state. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes the color, political color of our state gets overstated by particular political parties.
Yeah.
But because of that, there is an opportunity to balance the decisions made by a governor. And so in theory, it's I kind of like that. Because another way you could look at it is you have your own lieutenant governor.
Right.
You in Madison, you in the Lakes region. You get your own form of representation that might be very different from what a lieutenant governor would say if they represent Manchester or if they represent the Upper Valley. So in theory, it is, oh, cool, extra democracy, great.
Right.
I think the drawback is, of course, in part because it is so misunderstood or not understood, it is even more prone to gerrymandering because people don't really have a sense of urgency. Or we can talk a lot in the country about you can look at the congressional maps and be that is clearly gerrymandering. You are disenfranchising Democrats, or you're disenfranchising people of color,
right?
Whatever it might be. The general public doesn't have the same kind of urgency around it, and so it's easier to do without people raising a fuss. So I feel like people kind of go either way. I also just think we don't have structurally a government that reflects most people, and that is because we don't pay our representatives. And when you don't pay your representatives, but you still require them to do a significant amount of work, it means the only people that can be lawmakers are retired or independently wealthy.
Right.
And if I think about New Hampshire today and the various crises of housing and childcare, substance use, etc., the people that I want making decisions to get us out of these crises are people that know what it's like.
Right.
And if you haven't had a mortgage for a decade, you don't need to rent, you haven't tried to run a business or get a job in today's economy in the last couple decades, then you might not be making the best decisions for what we need. And so I do think there is an argument on this line of thinking that the Executive Council provides sort of another avenue that is a little bit more elevated because it's the second highest office in the state to potentially get some recognition and attention and leadership on some of these issues. You know, Chris Pappas, Colin Van Ostern, Chris Sununu, these were all young executive counselors. I say that knowing that right now the average age of the Executive Council is, I think, 73.
Spring chicken.
80% of them, I believe, are retired. So obviously I'm running to change that.
Right.
So the pendulum can swing in either direction, but as of right now, as long as we have this authority, I want to make sure it's being utilized to support what I think our state needs today.
Yeah. Wow. It is an interesting question, right? Of like, it sounds bad, but how much is too much democracy, right? Like, because there's no, I mean, well, it's big, and I feel like people sometimes they can argue past each other on this issue, right? Of people saying we're a democracy, no, we're a republic, and it's like we're both, you know, and it's like what's the optimal amount of letting people literally vote in elections to decide like issue by issue versus electing a representative to make decisions on their behalf, right? To reflect their will, you know, and it's like, and I feel like there's different states have different versions. Like some states you can have ballot initiatives and stuff like that. And you can get, you know, literally, hey, do we want, you know, abortion at a certain, you know, amount or not? People can vote on that on the state level. But I don't feel like we have much of that here in New Hampshire.
Well, I think at least when it comes to the Executive Council, it is a responsive and reactive authority. So the Executive Council cannot decide to do something. They can respond to what the governor wants. And there's some powerful examples. I mean, the governor, in my opinion, has appointed someone unfit for the Department of Education to lead the Department of Education. And is very extreme. It's very radical. You know, this isn't just like me splitting hairs and being like, I don't like, you know, his clothes or something. Like he's someone that is, I think, wreaking a lot of havoc on our public schools. And I would love to have an executive council to challenge that. Unfortunately, we don't currently have an executive council that is. But by the same token, you know, our Republican governor put a contract to fund Planned Parenthood. And our executive council, the majority of which are of his party, vetoed that funding and, you know, defunded Planned Parenthood. And so in that way, it's definitely not working.
Right.
And so part of it is we have to do what we can with it. The executive council, it cannot really be proactive. Maybe on the transportation aspect, there's some more proactive work. But yeah, a lot of it still comes down to who our governor is. And so for me, we know it. Just, you know, obviously I'm the Democratic nominee, and I'm very excited for Joyce Craig to be our next governor. We know, looking at the polls, it is an incredibly close race. And in fact, it is the closest race in the country. And so I'm looking at that and thinking, well, there's two reasons I need to get on council. One is, you know, if Joyce Craig is elected and has an agenda of which I support, she can't get anything done.
Right.
You know, like people could just stonewall her nominees for the Supreme Court or the Department of Ed or the Public Utilities Commission, you name it. And secondly, if Kelly Ayotte gets elected, there's a lot of things that I'm going to have concerns about, you know, if she sort of appoints the same or similar person to the Department of Ed. Now, again, I, as an executive counselor, cannot compel a Governor Ayotte to bring forward someone that I want necessarily, although I think a lot of times there's informal relationships that you build power with the people, but the best I can do is be a check on some of those, what I might consider to be problematic or disastrous decisions.
Yeah. I liked how you framed that just now as like, hey, I'm a Democrat and, we have an agenda as a party. But, this council system, it functions as a check on the governor. And that's always a question I like to ask people who are in politics and come on the show. I've had John Kuiper came on. He's a friend of mine, know him from Newmarket. Daglin McEachern came on. I wouldn't say I'm a friend of his. I'd met him once and he was very nice and agreed to come on the show. I'd like to think he's my friend. But, we live in a very polarized time. I'm tired of saying that, but you hear it everywhere. And, if you were elected, you wouldn't just be representing, the Democrats in District 1, right? Like you'd be representing all kinds of people. Tell me about your philosophy of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think being a small business owner, like a Main Street brick and mortar business owner, like it gives you a vantage point on what is the ground level like. There are a lot of people in District 1 that are very wealthy and they have a second home in the Lakes region, and maybe vote there. And, there are a lot of things I think I need to serve them in terms of making sure their lakes are healthy and clean. But when it comes down to like, who do I consider, I'm really looking at the aspects of New Hampshire that have been forgotten about, have been oppressed, have been sidelined or ignored for a very long time, and I don't think that, say, supporting working families comes at the expense of supporting people that are well off,
right.
And are just here to recreate.
Yeah.
I really think that a lot of my positions lift the tide.
Yeah.
And it's because it is informed by what is really happening. I think for too long we have had an executive council and I would say a state legislature that either willfully has their head in the sand or just is so unaware of how the other half lives. Mm-hmm. And you can construct a worldview and then write laws if you think that everyone lives the same way you do.
Yeah.
And everyone has access to healthcare and no one is food insecure and the housing is a little expensive but not that bad. And if that's your world, you are going to legislate from a particular perspective. But if you are both personally exposed to, but also aware of the lack of options for healthcare, for like the number of maternity wards that have shut down in our state, let alone our reproductive health centers that are facing shortfalls. If you are facing these pressures, I got to run because I got to deal with these pain points.
Right.
I'm not running because I think everyone in New Hampshire is groovy.
Right.
If I thought we were all cozy and comfortable, I don't think I have any place, running for office.
Yeah.
And there is, to me, a real sense for some of our lawmakers that things are just fine and their job is to just keep it, quote unquote, just fine. And I get that is working for a subset of people, but it is failing a lot of people. And so I really think of myself as running for, and this isn't a partisan thing, running for the people who New Hampshire is structurally creating a lot of pressure and a lot of pain, and it is becoming more challenging to live here. And, as I mentioned, I'm a third generation, and my grandfather had a restaurant, and he lived off of that. He raised a family having a restaurant and catering company. And then my dad, he was the county attorney. That's a public service job.
Yeah.
And he raised a family of 6 on a salary working in public service. You could not do that today.
Yeah.
And I now, following the footsteps of my grandfather, I have a business. And I see the squeeze that business owners face and that is in our local economies, especially if we get out of, a lot of the sort of municipal success stories of the Portsmouths, Somersworth has really struggled. And yet people there are proud and resilient and want better for their local communities. And every once in a while, there are things that we do at the state level that just get in the way. And so I do think of myself as supporting everyone.
Right.
But that has to come with a real perspective of who is getting the short end of the stick under this, under our policies and under our approach to government. And that's why I talk about public education. That's why I talk about reproductive access. That's why I talk about clean energy. These are things that I think will unlock a lot of potential for a lot of communities.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I really like in the first part of your answer to that question, you phrased it as, hey, this isn't like me advocating for these people who I think need help. It doesn't threaten the well-being of these people who are already doing pretty well, right? I mean, this is my opinion. I'm injecting my opinion. I don't care. I think we need more of that. We need more of like the non-zero sum framing of issues, particularly in the political world. And so it makes me very happy when I hear, people running talk in those terms, because it's, as you say, when we lift the tide, everyone is better off. And for my life to get better, yours doesn't have to get worse, no matter who you are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm not running for a legislative position, so there's a lot of things I can sort of speak to, like my beliefs and so forth. But I won't touch a single piece of policy.
Yeah.
I was at a candidates forum recently, and they have all the Dems and all the Republicans, and most of them running for legislative positions. And for example, you hear this idea, which is a Republican position of, because right now we have a 6-month abortion ban in New Hampshire, and there's a lot of sort of both response to that or defense of that. And even our pro-choice Republicans sort of stand by it, and they'll say this thing about like, I think it's good, I think it's enough, and women have reproductive rights in New Hampshire, and this keeps it, and I wouldn't make it any more restrictive. And then you just sort of have to ask the question of like, have any of you ever tried to get an abortion? Like, do you even know?
How do you know?
Right. Do you even know where you have to go? I mean, there's no place to get an abortion in Carroll County.
Wow.
Or in Coos County, or in Belknap County, or in Stratford County, or in Grafton County.
Yikes.
Like, yeah, they're all in the southern part of the state.
No safe and legal place, you might say. Right?
Exactly. There's no legitimate reproductive health care provider up here. And so, our state wants to then defund the only places, of which there's only 3, where you can get an abortion or a whole range of reproductive health care.
Right.
And so to sort of say, oh, it's fine, you have your reproductive rights, when you don't even know, or you might be part of the party that's dismantling reproductive access, you're not making it any better. And no one is harmed by the idea that we are going to provide for the rights that even many Republicans would claim that women deserve. And so to me, there is like a little bit of a hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And again, to me, I think it comes from that place of they don't know how the other half lives. Okay, maybe you don't think you need reproductive health care, which I first of all don't always buy.
Yeah.
But just because you don't need it doesn't mean our state doesn't need it.
Yeah.
And leadership requires you from getting outside of that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is a difference, as you say. We had someone else on the show. Her name is Sarah Palermo. She helps do fundraising for an organization called the New Hampshire Campaign for Legal Services. And when I was talking to her, she helped me understand there is a big distinction, right, between just because something is set in policy doesn't mean that, in practice, the goal is actually right. Like,
absolutely.
Say that you're comfortable with like, all right, you think 6 months or whatever is an appropriate standard and, whoopee, fine. That doesn't mean that everyone who wants it has access to the care that they, need or desire. And her area of expertise, legal services, they do a lot of work around, helping people who have like acute needs for legal help, get that help. And, you can have the law say tenants have these rights, you can't evict someone under these circumstances, or you have a right to, heat and pest-free apartment and this and this and this. But people actually having those things be true in their real lives is a different question than something being true to the letter of the law. So there's and it's good to talk about that, because I feel like so often sometimes when a policy victory is achieved, there's this instinct to be like, whoopee, we did it, and there's maybe not so much a follow-up, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really believe that asking someone for a vote and earning the the will of the voters to lead requires us to be concerned about outcomes.
Yeah.
It is not enough to say, oh, well, you have this right, so what's the big deal? If you are not actually looking at the consequences of the actions, and that to me is why I'm running for an executive position.
Yeah. You brought up your business, Teatotaller, which I'm a big fan of, and want to ask you about. Teatotaller is known and beloved for being a hub of the LGBTQ plus community in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire is the live free or die state. Tell me about that relationship, like between queerness and freedom. I think these things are naturally complementary, but maybe you encounter people who don't feel that way. Like this I think is a fascinating part of your experience and your identity. I'd like to hear your thoughts on.
Of course. I mean, I will say there's some aspect, I think, of my career owning this cafe company that I think people assume I sort of had a master plan, and
Sure.
I had this sort of encompassing philosophy about it.
I'll start a queer cafe and then
exactly. And
a
I
career in politics.
To be honest, it was like I am someone that is really just driven by opportunity.
Right.
In the sense that when something comes up and I see a need for something and I realize there's an opportunity to do something about it, that's when I leap in. And so an idea popped into my head as I was finishing grad school. I wanted there to be a cafe in my hometown. I had just quit drinking, and so that word teetotaler was obviously within my lexicon. And I was really into a lot of tea cafes at the time in Commonwealth countries, and I thought, well, wouldn't this be cool? And there really wasn't much more to it. And as anyone knows that opens a brick and mortar business with no prior experience, the business tells you what you need to know,
right.
And it teaches you very quickly because you're just like treading water. And so every day that I opened, I kind of learned something new about like, well, oh, maybe I should be serving food, or maybe I should have coffee, or oh, maybe live music will bring people in. And it was a real slog in the early days, and I can't say it was a very sophisticated brand in the sense that it wasn't entirely thoughtful. Like I thought, okay, I don't drink. I want there to be a place that doesn't drink. It's a little cheeky to call it Teetotaler.
Right.
Maybe people will know we make our own tea blends, whatever. And that was it.
Yeah.
And it was just as I, spent time and evolved as a proprietor, that the brand evolved with me. And, I had opened one, closed one, opened, moved it, opened another, so over the course of these sort of resets, each time had a little better sense of what I was doing from the brand perspective. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, and I think this was just because of who I was as a queer person, I had a lot of queer staff because there was just something unusual about Teetotaler in downtown Somersworth.
Yeah.
And some shows that we were doing were kind of eccentric and wild. And so over time, it was really my team that you sort of looked around and were like, wait, this feels like a very queer project. Mm-hmm. And there, at just some point, I decided I want to sort of double down on this. Yeah. I think a lot of cafes in the country are LGBTQ inclusive or safe spaces, but they might not be explicitly so. And I was like, oh, I want a brand
Mm-hmm.
is gayer than I am.
Right.
And
I want to be obvious.
Yeah, I want it to be
undeniable.
Undeniable, exactly. And fabulous and campy and fun
Right.
and silly and tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people in Somersworth that were kind of, for whatever reason, like kind of hip with that or on their own queer journey. And I think Somersworth had a lot of unique kind of LGBTQ success stories that were sort of unwritten.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I definitely think this would do well here. So over time, the mission became more explicit. And then, of course, that becomes like a feedback loop where then people respond to that. And they're like, well, when's the drag show or when's the drag story hour? And so we just began to build a brand and a program and a company that recognized how valuable that was to a lot of people. And of course, over the last 13 years, we've gotten to a place where we do see deliberately how meaningful that is to a lot of people, especially a lot of young queer people.
Right.
You know, to me, my concern had always been that the queer identity was always tied up with alcohol.
Right.
That when you're 16, 17, there's no space or place to even imagine who you are unless you're thinking about like a gay bar.
Yeah.
And that kind of presupposes that you're consuming alcohol. And so like the queer identity became tied up with being over the age of 21. And I know for me personally and many other queer people, it's like we were still wondering who we were and on our own individual journeys, but didn't have any sort of space or voice or people that we could trust that would help us understand. And so having a space that is just a signal and a lighthouse for the LGBTQ community, I think has just given people an affirmation. And it's also given an affirmation to a lot of the surrounding community.
Yeah.
Because Teetotaler is not just for some young queer, high schooler. It is for everyone in that kid's high school that might, for any number of reasons, have certain ideas or assumptions about a gay person, a queer person, a trans person, etc. And without any sort of response, to some of those ideas, that can lead down to bullying or to shame or to whatnot. And, I always think about some of the early drag shows that we did back in our Somersworth cafe. I mean, they would be packed. They would have more people than I can say because it broke the fire code for sure. But so many young people and not to sort of make too bold of an assumption, but it's like, I imagine much of them were just young, heterosexual, cisgender,
looking for something
kids
fun
that were just like,
do.
looking for something to do that isn't hanging out in the Burger King parking lot.
Right.
And to imagine all of them are going to grow up, they'll get married and have kids and raise families and get jobs and be in boardrooms and courtrooms and whatever, and think back, when I was in high school, I had this experience of just like really being like really celebrating and being comfortable with a very broad spectrum of identity. And I just think that is going to make the world a better place. Because that is going to be sort of a response to what a lot of people in the 80s and 90s grew up with, which was like silence.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the normalization, right, of different identities, there's a great notion of progress in that. And it's actually, I wasn't planning on asking about this, but you've got my mind thinking, and I'm kind of curious what your opinion is. People talk often now, like the commodification of pride, right, as an identity. I think this is maybe more common for younger folks who are, I think, a little more skeptical of like corporatized anything. But I can see it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? Every year, Pride comes around. I'm bisexual myself, and I have a lot of queer friends, and you'll hear both attitudes of like, oh man, all the big companies, they change their logo to rainbow. They don't actually care. They're just trying to sell us. And I feel like, you could take that as it's shallow and, they're maybe only doing it when it's safe. But the flip side is I bet someone in 1980 would have loved to be advertised to for being gay, But at the same time, there's something really, I don't know, kind of nauseating about
Yeah.
we're going to sell you your identity. So I don't know, like what's your take on that?
I mean, I definitely hear the, like, we need to understand and contextualize how our elders sort of what they fought for, and recognize that many of those fights have won. I am definitely susceptible to the belief that, like, corporations cannot be trusted. And, like, I think, it's like gay banks and gay airlines and whatever.
Right.
Like, there's probably some examples of corporations that it's an ethos thing and it's a year-round thing and it's part of their brand. And maybe I feel better about that. But, yeah, I think it's a marketing ploy. It's like the people that are discussing pride at a large corporation is the marketing teams.
Right.
It's not the CFO. It's not the chief compliance officer. It's not the CEO. It's not the people that deal with HR necessarily. I mean, certainly there are corporations that do, but, like, what we visibly see is marketing.
Right.
And so I'm always just skeptical of, like, sort of not aligning with a large corporation.
Right.
Obviously, I'm a small business owner. I believe you should buy local and buy independent.
Right.
And that extends, I think, to my belief of values and identity. And yeah, we see a lot of companies that have, like, now they're stripping away their sort of DEI initiatives.
Right.
And, I think, again, part of that is like, hey, if these were hollow to begin with, then part of me sort of feels like, okay, well, at least now we know.
Yeah.
But, I think there needs to be some just, like, base stakes. And I think there are, Disney is probably an evil corporation in many, many ways. It was nice to know that they had some might when Ron DeSantis wanted to completely target and diminish the rights of LGBTQ people because, Disney was going to, sort of threaten to block and make some moves there. So there is sort of a balance of, like, we do need to be playing this game at the 10,000 foot level where, unfortunately, because our governments are still steeped in a culture that is somewhat arcane, they then are more responsive to a large corporation, saying, we support the LGBTQ community than listening to their constituents. But from the pride perspective, I'm sort of like, I'm a little over it. I think also, I'm still disturbed by the proliferation of pride being an alcohol-centered brand, branding moment. It's for, like, all these vodka companies that are, like, the official sponsor of pride.
Yeah.
And not to be overly dogmatic about my teetotalism, but it's like, we don't need substance use at the centerpiece of figuring out who we are, especially when it's an aspect of one's identity that is hard to access in a sober and lucid way. Yeah. Because our culture is so sort of traumatized that we don't want to talk about what we like or who we like, or we're not vulnerable enough. And so we turn to substances.
Yeah,
and a lot of times it's
drink
alcohol.
to get there.
Exactly. And it's like, there's a lot of brands. I'm like, sure, you can give us free flights on Virgin Airlines. Great.
Yeah.
But the vodka stuff, I'm kind of like, we don't need that.
Yeah. Yeah. Man. Well, that's a great take. All right. We're coming up on time, but I'm going to squeeze in because I want your opinions on everything. I want to ask you one more question.
Go for it.
While I've got you here.
The clock's on.
The clock's on. All right. I saw that you graduated from the London School of Economics, which I think is cool. You're being demure right now. I think it's fair to say that it's an elite institution. You're also a small business owner, and clearly working class values are important to you. Tell me what it's like to talk about solutions to complicated problems in a time when a lot of people seem drawn to simple answers and want to reject nuance.
Okay. I'm sort of connecting the dots of how where the London School of Economics, what the through line is to that. I don't know.
I mean, it's a brain, like, in that you have, there's a poorly phrased question then. It
is an elite institution.
Right. The brainiac view, the intellectual, the academic view of the world.
Yes. Okay.
But how do you, if you're talking to someone on the streets of Somersworth, you wouldn't open a conversation with, hey, your house is expensive because of 12 complicated, reasons having to do with housing policy, right? Maybe you do.
I hear what you mean. Well, I have a couple ways of responding to that. The first is I think the way my brain works, I have a very simple brain, and that's not me sort of being facetious or trying to be modest or something.
Yeah.
The ways in which I feel like I have succeeded in whether it's academics or business or on boards I've served on is if I can understand something, I can break it down to its component parts. I then really can sort of get inside of an idea and I can explain it. I am not someone that can handle complexity. I'm usually the person in the room. I've served on some significant boards, and they'll be talking about some major update to the stock portfolio, and everyone's just sitting there paying attention, and I'm like, I don't understand anything you just said.
Yeah.
Could you break down what those things are, what you meant? And I think in some ways that has served me well because I am unashamed.
Yeah.
Because what you realize, of course, is when you say, "What is that?" There's other people around the table that are like, "Oh yeah, I actually didn't know."
Right.
Either. We were all just
and you
nodding
just
along.
made them more comfortable too. Yeah.
And so I think in a lot of ways, people would tell me that I'm an effective sort of communicator and educator because I can take something complex if I have learned it, whether it's the education freedom accounts that we currently have or the way that we fund hospitals and healthcare. If I understand it, I can then break it down and explain it. And I think I'm pretty good at doing that. And so I actually think I'm not someone that wants to exist in just jargony,
right,
cerebral space the whole time. The second thing, though, is I actually do think I give the benefit of the doubt to the mind of the constituent or recipient. Right. I've had some people, I give public speeches and whatever, and I've had some people that have criticized me because they're like, some of the words you use are too big, or they reference how past presidents, I think Obama was a good example where so much of the words he used were accessible language, and people see that as that was a way of being accessible to folks with less education, working class folks, and so forth. And I hear that. I'm totally for that, but there is some part of me that thinks we can respect the intelligence of our audience and the sort of their sort of intellectual aspiration. People want to understand, right, at some level why the education funding crisis. People want to understand the healthcare or the housing issue. I remember after the 2008 recession, it was all that subprime mortgages and the toxic assets,
the tranches,
and everyone was like, "What?
Yeah.
Why do we?" But there's a real. I think people want to know, but nobody's explaining it. Nobody is coming to them. They're just saying, "Oh, it's just some banks. Don't worry about it."
Right.
And it's well, but I think the devil is in the details a little bit, and if more people found that language accessible. I've had many people that have said, even in this race, "Oh, I've learned about the executive council many times, but nobody has ever explained it that way." And
I just said that, and it's true.
Who said that? And so I do think, people just learn differently, and it's worth trying again, or it's worth finding the way in, because what doesn't work for me is just, I'm going to give you a simple answer.
Right.
And because I think you're a simple person or live in a simple community, I actually want more people to feel like they can access the reality of something, because then they can be part of doing something about it. So yeah, I'm very mindful of, I'm not mindful of it. That's not the right word. I am very aware of it. But I think it's important, if we have this idea of people in, rural working communities have less education, so we have to go in there and just
tell
talk
them what
in
to
like,
think,
3-syllable words or,
Right.
2-syllable words or something. It's like, well, that's kind of demoralizing and condescending. Like, why don't we actually talk to them? Why don't we be authentic?
Right.
And that actually opens the opportunity for them to be authentic. Because I think if I can be authentic in the way I talk and the way I understand and describe things, that gives someone an opportunity to also say, I don't know what you mean. I
Yeah.
don't understand. Could you explain that in a different way?
Right.
But if we just use simple slogans, it's like, oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. And then people just talk past each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was a really great answer. Wow. I'm so happy. I've been happy with every guest, but I love the way you talk about these things and frame them. All right. Real quick, Emmett, what makes you optimistic about your work or the future of politics in New Hampshire or anything?
Oh, I mean, everything. I can't help it. I'm a very optimistic person in my nature. I also have just seen successes. I mean, I come from a community, a small town, that a lot of people have had opinions about and have told me, they're not very gracious opinions. And usually they're from like outside. And yet I have seen some really kind of incredible successes inside the community in terms of people doing wild things or crazy things or things that we just thought couldn't happen here. We've just had wins. And I'm like, oh, those were just myths that other people were kind of sharing and really just putting their own insecurities about their community. So I have seen the work pay off.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, then just keep going.
Emmett, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Can't wait to have you back someday.
Absolutely. I'll be on Route 16.
Maybe plug the election.
Yeah. If you're listening and you live, anywhere you live in the state of New Hampshire, you have an executive council election. It'll be on the same ballot that our president and governor's race is on. You should be voting in it. It's very important. If you live in District 1, the Lakes region, the North Country, the Tri-Cities, I hope you consider voting for me, Emmett Soldati.
All right. Thanks so much, Emmett.
Thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for spending some time with us, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can learn more about today's guest and how to get involved with or support their work in the show notes. If you'd like to suggest a guest for the show or have any story tips for our Good News in New Hampshire newsletter, shoot me a message at hello@granitegoodness.com. Music for this episode was provided by the band Sneaky Miles, who hail from Newmarket, New Hampshire. Until next time, I'm the creator of Granite Goodness and the host of the Granite Goodness podcast, Andy DeMeo. Thanks for listening.